Imagine somebody offers you a place in an experiment about memory. You show up, and they tell you to torture somebody. This was the situation faced by the people of the Stanley Milgram experiment. They were instructed to ask their victim questions. Each time they got a question wrong, they would be forced to give the victim an electric shock. And each time the electric shock would be higher until they reached 450 volts. Now, to be clear, people have died for as low as 42 volts. So if this situation was real, you would be committing 7th degree violent obliteration of the human soul. Luckily, your victim was a paid actor, who was only pretending to scream in pain, beg for mercy, before falling silent, implying that they had died, and they didn't actually have the heart condition they mentioned before you started electrocuting them. And if, at any point during the experiment, you said, hey, I'm going to stop electrocuting this person, the scientist next to you would go, how dare you? How dare you, okay? You have wasted all our budget now. All the $1 trillion up in flames, burned. We've wasted the budget. We spent so much money on this experiment, and now that you're refusing to electrocute him, we can't do anymore. This is an obvious logical fallacy, by the way. I'm sure the experimenters didn't realise it in the moment, but it wasn't necessary to bring in somebody to do the electric shock. If this genuinely was an experiment to test whether or not pain had an effect upon memory, they could just have a scientist do the electric shocking. They didn't need to bring in somebody else to do it. The same way that if the test subject refused to continue, they could just have the scientist who already worked there continue to do the electric shocking. Although at least one of the test subjects, after the experiment that is, did mention that they realised that they were most likely the test subject, not the other way around. What they were actually trying to test was how obedient were human beings, okay? Are human beings naturally going to electrocute another human being just because somebody who looks like they're in a position of authority tell you? Can you get people to do what you say if you just look the part? Sure enough, I once saw an alpha male cite this experiment as proof that if you just looked like you were in charge, all the betas would do what you said. Now, obviously there are different variations of this experiment, and each different variation produced a different compliance rate. In his book, Obedience to Authority, Stanley Milgram, the conductor of this experiment, lists 19 different variations of this experiment, although apparently there were actually 23 or 24 variations, depending on the source you consult. In certain variations, the participants were ordered to do the electrocutions over the phone. In other variations, the scientist telling you to electrocute this other person would be, say, 2 meters away from you, and another one it would be 6 or 10 meters away from you. They changed the distance. In some of them, the test subject was told to physically place the victim's hand over the electric shock, rather than just pressing a button. Overall, 80% of people were, at least for the most part, convinced that their victim was genuinely getting the electric shocks, 6% were unsure, and 14% suspected, or in fact were certain, that they were being lied to and that the victim was just faking it. I should say though, none of these experiments were done on a statistically significant number of people. Almost all variations of this experiment were done on 40 people, but a few of them were done on 20 people in fact. Now I should say that the overall obedience rate was 43%, meaning that 56.4% of people stopped short of 450. Although despite all my research of this experiment, I still don't believe that human nature is obedience to authority. The issue I take with this experiment is how the results are usually presented. The average article or video about this experiment goes something along the lines of, this is proof that humans are naturally obedient to those in positions of authority, and that explains why the Nazis were willing to kill so many people during the Holocaust. The SS guards and people were just taking orders. This proves that we could all kill people in horrific ways, and that we're all really just SS guards waiting for Hitler to tell us to kill some more Jews. In short, these people believe that obedience really is just a part of human nature, and that explains why people were willing to commit the Holocaust and every other atrocity. There is, of course, a whole host of logical fallacies that comes with this. Number one is that there is a massive difference between what the Nazis did and what they did in this experiment, okay? The Nazi soldiers that committed such atrocities knew that they had killed multiple people. The unfortunate participants of this experiment thought they may have killed one person, but probably not, because this is Yale, and Yale doesn't kill people. Indeed, they did do a version of this experiment outside of Yale, in somewhere that looked less professional, and sure enough, the compliance rate was a lot lower. The other glaring logical fallacy and the common explanation of this experiment is that if an SS guard, say, refused to activate the gas chamber to commit an execution, they would be executed as well. People did such terrible things, probably because they didn't want said terrible things done to them, and also because they'd been indoctrinated to believe that all Jews were evil and therefore must be slaughtered. The other thing I have to talk about is the idea of the agentic state. Milgram developed his theory of the agentic state, i.e. a state of mind that humans enter where they are obedient, okay? Where they don't see themselves as responsible for their own actions, but simply as a tool to carry out the will of the person who commanded them to do so. Now, I've not read Milgram's entire book, but I've read the part about his agentic state theory, and while I don't quite know what he means here, I think he's saying that the agentic state is a genuine biological emotional phenomenon. Now, I'm just following the orders. It's probably a mentality that a lot of soldiers use to justify doing terrible things. But Milgram seems to be saying that the agentic state is a genuine emotion that people feel, just as much as anger or lust. And here's the thing, if he was right, then we would know that it exists and we would have all felt it on a daily basis. Put it this way, while I don't believe humans are naturally obedient, I believe obedience is a very big part of our culture. You have to obey your boss on a daily basis, unless you're a child, in which you obey your teachers and your parents on a daily basis. So if the agentic state was real, we would all feel it on a daily basis. We would all feel this emotion and it's on a daily basis. The point I'm making is there was almost no evidence to prove that the agentic state exists. I think it's just something that Stanley Milgram made up for whatever reason. But let's move on to the thing I mentioned earlier about culture. I suppose there is quite a culture of obedience, let's say. It's at its worst when you're a child, I think, because as a child you're viewed as less intelligent, as naive, and so people take your ideas just not seriously at all. They're like, don't you talk back to me, you waste of space, you do what I say. You're viewed as completely subordinate to almost everybody older than you. Although it doesn't get a lot better when you're an adult. As an adult, you still have to do whatever your boss says, you know, because they know what's best, apparently. And if you're like a black person or a woman, you can still get viewed as subordinate, depending on where you live. That's why I would actually put the obedience down to three things. Number one, a problem in our culture that makes obedience so normalised that when an authority figure gives you a command that is obviously wrong, you still obey it, because they look like they're in a position of authority. There's also probably a few more reasons. The experimenter had before the experiment told them that the electroshocks weren't going to be lethal. And because, once again, Yale is such a well-respected university, at least at the time, that they probably assumed that nobody would ever die at Yale. So what can we take away from this experiment? Well, either nothing, or there is a problem in our culture that encourages us to be more obedient than we actually should be. And I would end this video by, telling you all to be the change you want to see, and encourage you to disobey authority and then purge the suppression from our culture. But that's quite often impossible. Hierarchical power structures are there because they have leverage over you, okay? School. If you're too disobedient, you get detention and get expelled, even though you're obviously in the right. And then in the workplace, your boss can fire you if you're too disobedient. If your spouse is too controlling, that's normally because they're the one who makes money and you don't. But ultimately, we do have to try and encourage disobeying unfair commands in our society. We have to make sure everybody knows how to, if you receive an order that involves you hurting another person or doing something terrible that you know is wrong, we have to make it easy to disobey that order. So if you ever receive a command that you know is wrong and you genuinely think that you can disobey it without getting into too much trouble, or you will get into trouble but you don't even care, then, please do it and encourage your colleagues and peers to do the same. And hopefully behaviour like that will become normal. It'll just become expected that if a person in a position of authority gives an order that's obviously stupid or evil, or a command that's obviously stupid and evil, then it will get disobeyed by everybody.